So this is a show about Jane Austen, and let me just begin by saying that yesterday, by way of preparation, I made a point of watching the new adaptation of Jane Austen's Persuasion. This is released on Netflix. Dakota Johnson plays Anne, and it's come in for a certain amount of derision, and worse. Whatever's worse than derision. And so I sat there kind of embarrassed by how much I was loving it. I was having a very stressful day. I have a very stressful life these days. It was just something wonderfully relaxing about Dakota Johnson and kind of doing her fourth wall, Fleabag style mugging. And eventually the other person in the room, who shall remain nameless, said rather stiffly, "Well, you're not a Jane Austen person." And I guess that's sort of true, except I hate the idea that there's such a thing as a Jane Austen person, because one thing that's really clear after 2 centuries is that all kinds of people are Jane Austen. There's some NFL player who reads Jane Austen. I just guarantee you that. And I mentioned before we went on the air just now or before the news, B.B. King's a Jane Austen fan, So I hate the idea that there's a Jane Austen person, but there probably is. Anyway, it's not for me to say we have great guests today. Right now, we are going to talk to Devaney Lozer, a professor of English at Arizona State University and the author of books, including The Making of Jane Austen. Her new book is Sister Novelists, Jane and Anna Maria Porter in the Age of Austen. She goes by Stone Cold Jane Austen. In her sidelight as a roller derby competitor, which is also very on brand. Roller derby was very big in Regency England. Walter Scott and Percy Shelley were both competed in roller derby, but women were not allowed to. It's just another thing that kind of comes up that way. So first of all, Devaney Lozer, welcome to our show.
Great to be here, Colin. Love that intro and your sense of humor.
Well, I may wear thin on you pretty quickly, but it's a good beginning anyway. And so maybe just start a little bit. I don't know. Maybe imagine somebody walking out of the Amazonian jungle or emerging from a coma or something. Somebody had really kind of no point of reference for Jane Austen, but hearing about the books, getting kind of interested. What would you say to that person? How would you introduce that person to the idea of Jane Austen?
I think I'd start by telling them that Jane Austen is the greatest novelist writing in the English language, and some say the greatest English language author, period. I think she's giving Shakespeare a run for her money these days. But she was born at a pretty tumultuous time, 1775, the late 18th century, during a moment of revolutions. And the Industrial Revolution, the American and French revolutions, what some people call the longest revolution, the revolution for women's rights. So all of these things inform her novels, and I think many of them continue to make her readable, rereadable, and topical today.
Yeah, there's a really kind of weird way in which her novels are very much a product of the moment they're set in. But they're also not, right? They spread very nicely. They travel well across time in most ways. I was just reading about how Louis Menand and Stephen Greenblatt in this course that they teach at Harvard have their students read wedding announcements in the New York Times. And wedding announcements in the Daily News. The Daily News wedding announcements are, sort of 1 or 2 class rungs down. People have gone to community colleges and the boroughs and stuff. But when these Harvard students are reading the wedding announcements in the New York Times, they're going, "Oh yeah, no, my father knows somebody who works at that law firm," or they're very familiar with the kind of class structure that is mostly represented in those wedding announcements. A sign maybe that one reason that Austen travels well is we haven't changed as much as we think we have.
That's a great assignment. But absolutely, I think there are people who describe her themes as universal. And I'm not sure that's 100% true, but I would say the ways that they deal with courtship, romance, money, and especially family conflict are obviously things that resonate from most periods and cultures.
Yeah, the money thing is really interesting. Particularly in the sense that, okay, so if you say, Austen kind of tells her, particularly her contemporary readers, how much money everybody has. It doesn't really mean quite as much to us. We don't know what 10,000 pounds meant in 1815 or whatever, but people did. People then did. Maybe you could say a little bit more about why that's so important.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, £10,000, which is Mr. Darcy's yearly, annual income. That's a lot of money, and they would have understood, and we're supposed to understand that's a lot of money. But I think the ways that we now ask people, "What do you do?" and don't see that as a prying question. Maybe it sometimes is, but we don't, I think, culturally see it that way now. To talk about a rich person and say, "How much is he or she worth?" was in the same way, I think, part of the culturally acceptable kinds of conversations one could have about a wealthy person. And, so I think that obviously women in particular from middle classes and above, since what was their most likely future was to marry or to rely on brothers and fathers to support them, what a man made and his marriageability based on that economic worth was really crucial.
I think it would be fair to say that also economics were probably less flexible than they are now. I mean, in reality, the American idea that it's a place where someone can change their economic status, that they can outgrow the class they were born into, is somewhat overrated. But, I mean, it is different from what you would have seen, I assume, in Regency England. I mean, whatever amount of money you started out with, you were unlikely to change social classes anyway as a result of making more money.
Truly, and well put. I mean, I think some of Austen's novels deal with this kind of attempt to move up and beyond one's born social class, Persuasion especially, which I know we're going to be talking about this hour. But she was well aware of the kinds of intractability of status and economic level, but also dealt with characters who did do some movement in one direction and another, as certainly happened then too.
I'm going to go back to your first statement, best novelist writing in the English language, and maybe more than that. So, in a way, that means it's about the words. And I was struck by a quote I found by Virginia Woolf, who said about Austen, "Of all great writers, she's the most difficult to catch in the act of greatness." I'm not sure I entirely understand what is meant by that, but I'm willing to bet that you do.
That's such a great quote. The way I read it, and I think you could read it many ways, but the way I read it is that it's difficult to break down the kinds of ways that she makes the magic work. That it's on the level of the word and phrase, it's on the level of the sentence, it's on the level of the plot. It all seems to work together so seamlessly and look so effortless. And I think that's what Woolf was trying to get at, that she's great, but it's hard to put your finger on how all of these parts add up to that greatness.
Right. I mean, she's not James Joyce. I mean, James Joyce is kind of letting you know what he's doing, in a very, very flashy way. She's kind of doing the other thing, which is kind of bewitching you without entirely revealing the nature of her spells.
And I think there are people who believe she must have been drawing on real people because her characters seem so real, even still, which is kind of amazing.
Well, she does somewhat, right? I mean, and some of the people are based on her family, right? I mean, to a certain degree, the romantic lead in Persuasion is kind of one of her brothers.
So I think there is evidence that she certainly paid close attention to the people around her and probably drew on her circle of acquaintance and her family members. But I'm not sure I see direct one-to-one correspondence between Austen's Captain Wentworth and her naval brothers. Certainly her naval brothers were people she gained knowledge from about the British, the Royal Navy. And, these were things that she obviously was a careful student of. But I'm not sure I see direct inspirations necessarily at work. And she, I think, would have denied it in any case. So it depends whether you want to take her word for it or not.
Yeah, and I don't know anything close to what you know about this, obviously. But one of the things that has always jumped out at me from Persuasion is the idea of the sea captain's wife going to sea with the captain. To me, it's one of the big sort of moments and sort of predictive of where things wind up going. And that, I think, is true of her. Is it George? I can't tell the brothers apart. But didn't one of the brothers have a wife who did sail around with him?
Yeah, it was Charles Austen. And there's a fine book by Sheila Johnson Kindred about that wife called Jane Austen's Transatlantic Sister. So for anybody who wants to learn more about what a real life naval wife, her experiences look like, that biography, which came out just a couple of years ago, I think does a good job of describing the dailiness of that world.
I think the other thing that maybe young people who are, uninitiated, getting initiated to Austen might not quite understand, although it's certainly there in some of the movies, is that she's funny. Fran Lebowitz was talking about her in this Morgan Library project that they did. She said, if you're a truth teller, you better be funny or they'll kill you. And I think that's kind of an interesting point about Austen, is that she finds things funny, things that are also an outrage, an imposition, an unfairness, grandstanding. All of those things strike her as funny, probably at the same time as making her angry.
I love that Morgan video series, by the way. And there's another fabulous one that your listeners should watch with Cornel West.
Yes.
About Jane Austen. These are wonderful.
The way he goes on about Emma is really interesting, actually.
Wonderful.
But talk a little bit about Austen and humor.
Yeah, Austen is obviously very funny. I mean, I guess it's not obvious to first-time readers necessarily, because I think the language has become a little bit of a challenge for a lot of first-time readers. It can strike, I think, early 21st century readers, or at least strikes my students often, as a little bit stiff. And you have to help break it down for them, the kinds of indirection and irony and satiric work going on in a lot of these sentences, from the first sentence of Pride and Prejudice, the most famous first sentence, I think, of any novel, forward. You don't always catch it at first, but that's also what's amazing about Austen. You can read her for the romance and the love and the sentimentality and get a lot out of it. You can read her for the comedy, and you can read her for the social criticism, and just all of these possible ways to read and reread these texts and see something new each time. But I am definitely someone who loves the comedy and satire parts and the social criticism parts of these books.
One of the things you've written about is the way that Austen both reinforces tradition and challenges it. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that. I mean, listening to Cornel West in the video that you referenced, and knowing also that B.B. King purports to be a Jane Austen fan, I'm thinking, wow, if you're familiar with systemic unfairness in your own life, that's one of the ways that you're going to be able to read Austen. I'm guessing that that's one of the lessons that does travel well across time. But in another sense, second wave feminists have kind of traditionally, or in some cases, had problems with Austen because she's heteronormative, because the goal always seems to be marriage. That's how you win the pot in the game. And they want more than that. So I don't know. I don't know what question I'm asking you, but I know you'll have a great answer.
Well, there are a lot of great questions in there and threads in there. I do think that Austen is describing a world that's unfair. And she's doing it from the perspective of a middle-class woman, often, and a white woman. So I think she does better to make sense of the world from that perspective, perhaps, than from other perspectives of her time or our own. But the stories and the ways that they unpack those unfairnesses, those injustices, are subtle and not heavy-handed. These are not novels that tell you, and here's what you should come away thinking. They open up questions and open up problems, and they don't even end up punishing a lot of their worst characters all that much. So I think it allows us to imagine a world, to see things that aren't fair, especially, I think, again, in terms of gender and class, and to try to question what an individual does in these systems. And, the way that I try to tell it to my students is, the novels can be a kind of guide to how to live a meaningful life in a world that's deeply unfair. But they're very much written for individuals to figure that out, rather than as a kind of social blueprint for how to change society.
And I think a point that you've made that I think is a good one, too, is, okay, so let's say one is bothered by the way these novels, when they finally bear fruit, at the end, the fruit is marriage. So read other parts more intensely. She's not going to write Annie Hall, She just isn't the time to write about a relationship that ultimately doesn't work out all that well. But there's so much going on in the rest of the book that it might be a mistake to over-focus on the quote-unquote happy ending that is marriage.
unquestionably. And I'm glad you brought us back around to that. And I think that's a kind of stereotyping of what second wave feminist literary criticism was doing. It wasn't all doing that with Austen, but to the extent that it was over focusing on the endings in marriage. I mean, these are comedies. Of course they end in marriage. It's a generic expectation for, that she followed and kept to that convention. But if you read the actual marriages that she describes, they are quite cynically outlined. The Bennets, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, what a cynical view and not a very happy sense of what marriage looks like after the wedding day.
Right. And so much of it does appear at times to be this kind of board game that you have to kind of figure out and move your pieces onto the right squares and stuff like that. She does seem to have a somewhat cynical view of an awful lot of that and kind of understand it for what it is. I guess I want to get Deborah into this pretty soon, so we're going to take a break in just a second. But, I guess a point you were making earlier is worth reemphasizing, which is you can read these books a lot of ways. And I think a lot of people read them as courtship, romance, novels, whatever that's called. That's the kind of sense of here's a lovely story about someone overcoming adversity and, ultimately getting to a place of happiness, and some funny stuff, some interesting stuff happens along the way, but it's just kind of a pleasurable story. And I would assume you would say there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that there's no necessity of limiting one's self to that kind of a reading.
And I've actually been talking about this with Deborah for, about a decade now. The idea that these novels are kind of Rorschach test. You can go to them and pick and choose and find what you want there. So I do think there are more expansive and more limited ways to read them. Absolutely. But the way that you put it, that you can make a choice and that it should be okay to make the choice to emphasize certain parts and not others. That's what critics do all the time, too. So I think it's fine that readers should be encouraged or allowed to have that approach to these novels, too. Yeah,
I think Leibowitz in that interview talks about the difference between a mirror and a door. She's, I think, somewhat contemptuous in a Fran Lebowitz way of people who would use Austen or any novel as a mirror to tell them more about themselves and their own lives. But I think that's actually a totally legitimate thing to do. Her argument is, no, use it as a door. Go find out what other lives are like.
Yeah, and I think ideally, and this is maybe where my perspective as an educator comes in, things that start out at mirrors can turn into doors. So that, that's what you hope you're doing, right? By reading and investigating questions culturally and historically.
Absolutely. I mean, if you see something of your own life in a Jane Austen novel, and if it's let's say unflatteringly portrayed, you could say, oh, well, I'm living the wrong set of values here. I should open a door. I should go someplace else. And I would guess you probably run into people who say, yeah, Jane Austen changed my life.
All the time. And I'm certainly one of them.
All right. Well, you married a Jane Austen scholar. I mean, you got the roller derby name. You got the whole thing. You've gone in 100%, I think. So
all Jane all the time.
All Jane all the time. All right. Let's grab a break here. And we're going to come back. She is going to stay with us. But there's going to be another person here, a person I haven't seen in quite a few decades, and I'm excited to talk to. We're back. We're going to be talking about Jane Austen the whole way, and Devaney Lozer, who's been with us, is going to be with us the whole way. Professor of English at Arizona State University, author of books including The Making of Jane Austen. Her new book is Sister Novelists, Jane and Anna Maria Porter in the Age of Austen. And joining us now is Deborah Yaffe, author of Among the Janeites, A Journey Through the World of Jane Austen Fandom. Deborah Yaffe and I don't really know when it was, Deborah. I'm going to guess that it was before the Emma Thompson, Hugh Grant Sense and Sensibility adaptation. I'm just locating our long before. I have no idea. Was it in the 80s?
1986.
Oh. All right, so that's long before. Okay, so Deborah Yaffe was an intern at the Hartford Courant and a very, very good intern. We knew that she would achieve greatness, and she has. And it's great to hear your voice again. Send me an email, and I'll catch you up on one or two things. Some of your former coworkers.
Definitely.
So first of all, maybe explain the term Janeite.
So the word Janeite was coined at the very end of the 19th century by a Victorian literary critic called George Saintsbury, who wrote an introduction to a famous edition of Pride and Prejudice. It's famous because the cover has this elaborate peacock design on it. It's very beautiful. I have it on my cell phone case just as an extra little detail there. So Saintsbury coined this term, and then maybe 20 or so years later, Rudyard Kipling wrote a short story called The Janeites, which is about a group of people in the trenches in World War I who discover a shared affinity for Jane Austen, and she becomes a kind of talisman and code word and secret society that helps them survive the horrors of the trenches. So the term means essentially, rabid Jane Austen fan. From time to time used pejoratively in the sense of, people who are really crazy. But I would say these days, Janeites tend to embrace that term as a beloved moniker. And I'm certainly in that category. I proudly call myself a Janeite.
Yeah, although Devaney, there is something a little cultish sounding. Just the word Janeites feels like something, where you can't go to the bathroom or something. And, there's like lots of rules. That's not at all what it means. How comfortable are you with a term like that?
I use it comfortably. To me, it means fan and enthusiast. And I hope that critics can also occasionally and perhaps even regularly be fans and enthusiasts. So I very much embrace this label, and you don't enjoy all parts of the fandom. Anytime you're part of a cult, as you call it, or a group or a club, there are disagreements, and some of them are personally felt and difficult. But to me, that's also something that is a big tent approach to what it means to read and care about books.
So I want to ask both of you, but let's start with you, Deborah. I know this is a hard thing to measure, but how close to peak Jane Austen are we right now? I was making a joke about 1995. The truth is, 1995, right around then, there was just sort of a ton of activity in terms of adaptations and stuff like that. But there's so much more that can be done now. There's just a lot of hashtag Regency stuff. There's Jane Austen TikTok. I'm not 100% sure I know what that is, but I can imagine. So, Deborah, I don't know, as you look at the Janeites and what they're up to these days, have we gone up exponentially in terms of engagement?
It's hard to say. You're right that the 1995 to 97 period was a pretty important one for the fandom. The 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, which is the one where Colin Firth emerges from the lake in a wet shirt as Mr. Darcy, that one was very important to galvanizing a lot of new fans. Membership in visits to the Jane Austen's House Museum in England went way up that year. Membership in the Jane Austen Society of North America went way up. And there were something like 5 Jane Austen adaptations that came out in this short period of time. And that was also right around the time that the internet was taking off. So it provided a way for all of these new fans to find each other and kind of stoke their enthusiasms by talking a lot. So that was a sort of peak Jane Austen moment. Whether we're in one now, I think that nowadays we've got social media, so we have the opportunity to have many more fragmented, smaller communities even than we did when we were not looking at social media, but just looking at the internet as a whole. And so maybe that provides the opportunity for people to find exactly the kind of Jane Austen fan that they want to talk to. And whether that makes for more or less engagement, I don't know. That's a question on politics is making us ask these days too. So maybe it applies to Jane Austen fandom as well.
Yeah. And Deborah, I'm also thinking about so-called user-generated content. One of the other things that the Digisphere really made popular, not that you couldn't have written your own, lesbian Jane Austen fan fiction or something, in 1980. Of course you could have. But there's a way in which this is such a huge mound of potting soil for all kinds of people wanting to put their own stamp on things. And I would assume that Jane Austen is a very, very inviting place to do that kind of gardening.
Oh, absolutely. There are huge numbers of Jane Austen fan fiction works. Many of them about Pride and Prejudice. That's certainly by far the most fertile soil, to continue your metaphor. But because the internet now allows for self-publishing and allows for fan fiction communities where people can put their work out there and share it with an appreciative audience, that certainly makes it easier than back when you had to actually, pay a vanity press to publish something if you couldn't get a commercial publisher interested in you. But there certainly was Jane Austen fan fiction before the internet. I think that the movies and the way that they brought a particular vision of Jane Austen to a larger audience definitely encouraged a lot more fan fiction writers. The movies tend to emphasize the romance elements of the books. And so a lot of the fan fiction that you see nowadays is are basically romance novels or romance stories that jump off from Jane Austen's characters or from things that are in the movies.
And Devaney, another thing that is not unique to our age, but I think is amplified by our age, is participation in various cons, like Comic-Con. I don't know if there's a specific Jane Austen con that you can go to, but that the idea of the kind of cosplay aspect of it, dressing up in Regency. There's even a movie called Austenland, which is about this Jane Austen fantasy camp where you go and you kind of live as a Jane Austen character and find romance with some paid actor. But I'm wondering about that too. I feel like we're living in an era of reenactors and sort of physical living outers of their dreams.
Yes, and there is a virtual Jane Con that's relatively new, pandemic new, and there's a Jane Con called that exactly in Australia. But most Jane Austen societies date to the mid-20th or the late 20th century and didn't use con yet. So there have been these author societies for a very long time, and they've involved some level of cosplay for a very long time. I talked a little bit in the making of Jane Austen about the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century using cosplay as part of its work. So absolutely, this idea that people who like a certain thing in common get together and play dress up or use costuming. I think there are people who prefer to call it dress than costume in the world that Deborah and I inhabit, this Janeite world. But absolutely, there's a sense that you are a kind of reenactor or at least explorer of what these characters might mean then and now.
So, Devaney, I also want to talk about another thing, which is, and this doesn't have anything to do with the internet, but there's sort of a way in which also Jane Austen is an intergenerational bonding experience. I know your mother introduced you to Pride and Prejudice. There's sort of a way in which, I mean, I expect Lily Tyson, who's the producer of this episode, I do expect that little Theodora Weinberger Tyson is going to be, handed a copy of Sense and Sensibility or something as soon as she's ready. I mean, that's sort of a thing, right? That you share. There's something that you share with your, the next generation down from you.
Absolutely. This idea that there are ways that mothers and daughters in particular bond over these novels, or that's a connector for these novels. I get students all the time, some saying it while rolling their eyes and some saying it sentimentally. My mom made me take this Jane Austen class. I think there's this sense that these books can connect across generations. We see this in the Jane Austen Society in North America too. Sometimes mothers and daughters come together to these. Men are less often in these spaces, and Deborah can talk more about that because her book deals directly with this.
Right, that's exactly where I'm going. And
of course, it's actually my father who introduced me to Jane Austen, so I'm the outlier here among the mother-daughter crowd.
Right, I feel guilty. I mean, my son and I watch Die Hard every Christmas, and we watch Independence Day every July 4th, and that's sort of what I've done for him culturally. But yeah, there is sort of a thing called an Austen bro, right? Deborah, maybe you can say a little bit about sort of men and Jane Austen.
Well, I'm sure Devaney knows, more about the history of this than I do, but I think originally, at least, actually, Jane Austen most of Jane Austen's fans were men in the late 19th, early 20th century. She was considered kind of a tough, astringent writer, not the kind of soft, sentimental writer that girls would like. And then I think my guess would be, but Devaney can speak to this more, my guess would be that there were, of course, plenty of feminists who were interested in her in the first half of the 20th century, but the real crystallization of the idea that Jane Austen was somehow a girly author, which I don't agree with, but that view sort of crystallized around the movies, I think, which, as I said before, tended to be very romance focused, and romance being typed as somehow a female interest. Again, something I don't necessarily agree with, but there we have it. And so the attendance at the Jane Austen events that I've been to has tended to skew female. And women don't necessarily mind that because, spaces where women predominate tend to be spaces where women get listened to maybe more than they always do in a more evenly distributed space. But so I think, Ted Scheinman, who's the author of a fun book called Camp Austen, which is another book about Jane Austen fandom, just recently wrote a piece for GQ where he talked about what it's like to be a man in these spaces that are predominantly female, these Austen spaces. So I guess there's still space for those guys, even though they're going to be outnumbered.
All right, so let's take a break here. We do have to talk about the way so many people these days are introduced to Jane Austen, which turns out not to be by one of those book things. All right, we are back. It's time to say some thank yous, starting with Kat Pastor. She's our technical producer. She's the one who's firing off all these clips and things like that and keeping the show moving. Lily Tyson is the senior producer of the Colin McEnroe show, but she's also the producer of this episode, and I'm very happy about that. So we are going to start talking about adaptations with our two guests right now. Our guest would be Deborah Yaffe, author of Among the Janeites, A Journey Through the World of Jane Austen Fandom, and Devaney Lozer, professor of English at Arizona State University, author of books including The Making of Jane Austen. Let's begin with an adaptation that I think is accorded quite a bit of reverence. So let's just get this one out of the way. This is B1, Kat.
Miss Bennet,
I did not expect to see you, sir. We understood all the family were from home, or we should never have presumed.
I returned a day early. Excuse me, your parents are in good health?
Yes, they are very well. Thank you, sir.
I'm glad to hear it. How long have you been in this part of the country?
But 2 days, sir.
And where you stay?
At the inn at Lambton?
Oh, yes, of course. Well, I'm just arrived myself. And your parents are in good health? And all your sisters?
Yes. They're all in excellent health, sir.
Excuse me.
The man himself, I presume.
Just as handsome as in his portrait, though perhaps a little less formally attired.
You must leave here at once.
Of course, if you wish.
Oh, I wish we'd never come.
That, of course, is Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy. I've never known how to say this actor's name. Jennifer Ailey? I don't know. She saved the world in Contagion. I should know how to say her name, as Elizabeth Bennet. And I think here we are also introduced to a particular kind of mid-90s version of maleness that is the somewhat stammering, bad and awkward at small talk Hugh Grant, Colin Firth person that was very much in vogue at that time. But I want to ask both of you. I'll start with you, Deborah. If let's say this is a good adaptation that gets some reverence, what makes a good adaptation? Why is one thing good and maybe another one not so much?
Well, obviously, this is a question that will be answered differently by different people. For me, an adaptation is good if it captures the spirit of the original work in some way. And that adaptation to me is one of the very best because it's very true to the kind of blend of romance and humor and family drama that characterizes Pride and Prejudice. It's a really funny adaptation. It's beautifully acted. It has some moments of genuine pathos and feeling in it. And it's just beautifully written and beautifully produced in every way. And part of the reason that it made such an impact, I think, is because it was also one of the very first Jane Austen adaptations for television that deployed some of the kind of infrastructure of film, in the sense that it had beautiful production values, it had beautiful outdoor shooting, it had great costumes. It did not seem like it was a filmed play, as many of the older TV adaptations did. And so it kind of brought people into a much more real feeling kind of atmosphere than some of the older adaptations had.
Yeah, great answer. Devaney, I don't know whether you want to expand on that or add to it.
Oh, I think Deborah captured it beautifully. And I also think the age at which you see an adaptation has something to do with which one turns out to be your favorite.
Well, we are all baby ducks. We imprint, on everything. And so this would be no exception. So from the same period, we have the Sense and Sensibility adaptation. This is Emma Thompson as Eleanor Dashwood, the aforementioned Hugh Grant as Edward. Here we go.
Eleanor, I met Lucy when I was very young. Had I had an active profession, I should never have felt such an idle and foolish inclination. My behavior at Norland was very wrong. But I convinced myself that you felt any friendship for me. and that it was my heart alone that I was risking. I've come here with no expectations, only to profess, now that I am at liberty to do so, that my heart is, and always will be, yours.
So, Devaney, let's talk about this too, because in this particular clip, you hear a man doing almost all the talking. But there is a way in which to make things bankable in order to get some fairly big name stars attached to them. I'm assuming that Hollywood or whoever is doing the adapting, or the BBC or whoever, thinks, well, there got to be some pretty strong male roles here. So did they put their thumb on the scale to get that?
I think so. And I wrote a piece for The Atlantic years ago about Sense and Sensibility and the ways that it turned the male characters into new sensitive men, which your comment was getting at too earlier, Colin. So I think these adaptations fleshed out the male characters in ways that appeal to contemporary audiences.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes total sense. Yeah, Deborah, what did you want to say about that?
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say about that adaptation, so I should start by saying that is my single favorite Jane Austen adaptation. I just love that movie on every level. But I think the ways in which adaptations differ from the novels is very apparent in that movie. Because Jane Austen has this narrative voice that always undercuts or makes ironic some of the apparently romantic things that are going on in the stories. And you can't ever quite get that ironic voice in the movies because it's very difficult to convey that. So for instance, in the scene that you played, Edward says, "I've come here with no expectations." He doesn't actually say that in the novel. In the novel, there's a line that in the voice of the narrator that says, even though Edward talked about how uncertain he was, he did not, when he arrived to propose to Eleanor, he did not, upon the whole, expect a very cool reception. But it was his business to say that he did, and he said it very prettily. So she kind of undercuts the romance of the proposal moment by saying, look, he knew that she was going to get accepted. And you can't really, it doesn't really come across in the movie, which doesn't bother me at all as a viewer of the movie. And it doesn't even really bother me as someone who likes the novel. I'm happy to see them as different things, but they are different.
So we've been dwelling in 1995. We might as well just stay in 1995 for one more clip. This is, of course, the other Jane Austen movie or adaptation from 1995, Clueless.
I don't know why Dion's going out with a high school boy. They're like dogs. You have to clean them and feed them, and they're just like these nervous creatures that jump and slobber all over you. Ew! Get off of me! As if!
Deborah, first of all, we need to talk in a more global way about the relationship of Jane Austen fans to Jane Austen adaptations, because there is certainly a theory that one of the struggles with adaptations is dealing with the reactions of people who really care passionately about Jane Austen, and that seems to be the case with a lot of them. Although I feel like Clueless kind of gets a pass somehow. There's this sort of, because I guess it's not really a Jane Austen adaptation, but I sense that it's kind of beloved by people who might have a hard time with other kind of fast and loose adaptations.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Janeites that I know all love Clueless, and Clueless is another of my very favorite Jane Austen adaptations. I think it actually is pretty true to the spirit of Jane Austen, the way that I was saying I like my adaptations to be, because it is very funny. It is pretty faithful to the plot. And it develops a language, a kind of special language that is very important to the effect of the movie. And Jane Austen's books are all about this kind of special language that she has developed. So I think in that sense, Clueless is a really great Jane Austen adaptation.
Yeah, I don't know. Devaney, did you want to react to, I'm sure you have strong thoughts about Clueless as well.
Oh, I love Clueless. I think Deborah hit the nail on the head there. But the fact that it's not set in the early 19th century means that people who go to the film to have some kind of replication experience of the novel aren't worried about that. They know it's not going to happen.
All right. So we're going to run out of time here. But maybe we need to jump forward to, well, in my case, to yesterday. So yesterday, knowing that I was going to have these two formidable Jane Austen experts to talk to, I was doing everything I could to get ready. But one of the things that I did was I decided to watch this very controversial adaptation of Persuasion. It's on Netflix. It stars Dakota Johnson as Anne Elliot. Let's hear a little bit of how that sounds.
Now I'm single and thriving. spend my time drinking fine wines, enjoying warm baths, and lying face down on my bed. Like I said, thriving. Who needs romance when one has family?
So I said this at the beginning of the show. I'm watching this thing yesterday, and I know that I'm supposed to have a certain amount of languid contempt for this thing based on what I'm reading on social media, and even it's like numbers on Rotten Tomatoes and stuff. And I'm just really laughing a lot and kind of enjoying Dakota Johnson's mugging and her kind of, Fleabag fourth wall stuff that she's doing. And eventually the other person in the room said, in a not entirely pleasant way, well, you're not a Jane Austen person. But I'm wondering what you two Jane Austen people think about this. And Devaney, maybe you can get us started. I mean, I know there's problems. I know Dakota Johnson is kind of, well, I mean, to put it bluntly, way too hot and wears too much makeup to really be Anne. But I mean, did this movie bother you a lot?
No, I didn't expect I would love it based on the amount of hate it got. But I actually watched it a second time last night, and parts of it had grown on me since the first time I watched it. I think there are things here that are really thoughtful and that are interesting turns on what goes on in the novel. And of course, the minor characters steal the show.
Deborah, I'm 50% relieved that at least one person doesn't mind that I liked it. How about you?
Well, I mean, I certainly don't mind that you liked it. I mean, anybody should enjoy anything they want to. I'm not crazy about this movie, which I've only seen once, but just because I guess I'm not willing to let go of all those things that Devaney just described, because to me, that's what persuasion is. And there's nothing wrong with making a rom-com about a klutzy heroine who drinks too much, but then why make Persuasion? Just go make that other story that isn't Persuasion.
Yeah, I think they did. It was called Bridget Jones' Diaries, but continue.
Well, yeah, I mean, and a million other rom-coms, which is fine, and I like them too. But if, you're going to brand it as Jane Austen's Persuasion, I would like it to have the spirit of Jane Austen's Persuasion. To me, this movie pretty much didn't, with the exception of, as Devaney said, some of the secondary characters were well done. It had its moments, but overall, I was not thrilled with it.
Well, I dare not ask you folks another question because we're essentially out of time, but it's been so great to talk to you. Thanks again to both of you for being here, Devaney Lozer, Deborah Yaffe. You can read about them on our webpage. Thanks also especially to Lily Tyson for conceiving of this episode and executing it so expertly. And thanks to Kat for making the whole thing happen.